Okay, so this video is for AP Bio topic 3.4 and an introduction to metabolic pathways. So a metabolic pathway is really referring to different chemical reactions that are happening in a particular sequence or order within an organism or within a cell. So an organism's metabolism is the totality of all the chemical reactions happening within that organism. So generally, as a heterotroph, a mammal, we are going to use cellular respiration or aerobic respiration as one of our main metabolic pathways, so one of the main chemical reactions that happen within our body. So as we go through aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration, we're basically transforming or changing matter and energy. Now, metabolism is going to require enzymes. So enzymes are involved in these metabolic pathways. Now, I want you to think about these two words in our title, metabolic pathway. So metabolism and all the chemical reactions happening in an organism. So metabolic, we're talking about chemical reactions. And then your knowledge of the word pathway. Pathways are like a series of steps. So here, in a metabolic pathway, we have a starting molecule and we have an ending molecule. It's not just from like A to B, but rather from like A to B to C to D. There's a pathway involved. There's multiple reactions involved. So let's say we start with molecule A. Now, these metabolic pathways do require enzymes. So if you are in AP Bio, we just learned in 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, all about enzymes. So here we have this enzyme that's going to facilitate the reaction from A to B. Now, that enzyme's active site is going to complementarily fit a molecule A. The reaction is going to turn A into B. Then, the second step in a pathway requires a different enzyme. So here we are looking at enzyme number 2. And enzyme number 2 is going to convert molecule B into molecule C. Then, so now let's pause real fast and use some enzyme words. So A is a substrate. B is the product of enzyme 1, while also being the substrate of enzyme 2. Now C is the product of enzyme 2. However, it's also the substrate to enzyme 3. So we can see here how this pathway is a series of reactions all controlled by enzymes. So in our example here, molecule D is our final product. So here we have a metabolic pathway. Now the two metabolic pathways discussed in Unit 3 for AP Bio are cellular respiration, that is a series of chemical reactions all controlled by enzymes to transform matter, our food, and energy. So we're going to take that potential energy stored in the bonds of our food and convert it into ATP. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more. Oh, here's the words. So the pathway started with substrate A and through a series of chemical reactions produced product D. Now there are two kinds of metabolic pathways that we have. So we have, here we go. We have catabolic pathways as well as anabolic pathways. So cellular respiration is a catabolic pathway that basically is going to transform sugar into carbon dioxide and water, kind of, and oxygen. And so what's going to happen is that sugar, though, was broken down, and through a series of reactions, we broke sugar down and released energy along the way. So a catabolic pathway is an energy-releasing pathway, and it involves breaking down complex molecules. Whereas an anabolic pathway is going to build. Here I have a polypeptide, but in actuality, photosynthesis is a wonderful example of an anabolic pathway. This is going to consume energy to build complex molecules. So in photosynthesis, we're consuming energy, taking in energy from the sun, converting it into ATP and NADPH, and then we're going to build carbon dioxide into organic molecules. So it's an anabolic pathway that requires energy to build. Okay. Now, in these pathways, there are two kinds of reactions. So earlier, the catabolic and anabolic pathways were made of multiple reactions in a series of events. However, each of those reactions can be one of two types. We have two kinds of reactions. They can either be exergonic, which is an energy-releasing pathway, energy-releasing reaction, or they can be endergonic, which is an energy-requiring reaction. So if we look at this in graph form, here, if we look at the amount of free and available energy, so we have potential energy, maybe this is in like carbohydrates. So maybe it's a glucose monomer or starch or something. So here you have a lot of potential energy. And in like a reaction that happens, actually if this was like starch, it'd be like a pathway. But anyway, so let's say you have a lot of potential energy in some reactants. Then the reaction occurs, and throughout that reaction, energy is released. So there's less energy remaining in the product. So the amount of energy that was actually released in this exergonic reaction can be measured. And so this reaction here would be an exergonic reaction. This is where, I'm not sure, maybe your teachers will talk about delta G, but that's like a measure of the amount of energy released or consumed during chemical reactions. Now, if we look at the opposite of this, an endergonic reaction, this is where energy is invested during the reaction. So in the beginning of glycolysis, you'll see in cellular respiration, the first step is ATP is being invested and a phosphate group is being added to glucose. Like that is an energy requiring step, and we call that an endergonic reaction. Okay, because it required energy. And here we are talking about energy, but let's go ahead and define it a little bit and talk a bit about ATP. So ATP is our energy currency of our cell. It's what our cells use for energy. And so ATP is what cells use, and through the process of cellular respiration, we start with a lot of potential energy in glucose, and throughout the metabolic pathway of cellular respiration, we will break it down and release energy in the form of ATP. However, let's go ahead and talk about the structure of ATP. So ATP has three parts basically. We have a ribose sugar. So this is a 5-carbon sugar. This is the same sugar you would find in RNA nucleotides, ribose. And then there is a nitrogen base. In this example, it's adenine. Again, this is the same nitrogen base you'd find in nucleotides. And then there are 3 phosphate groups. So if you are familiar with DNA or RNA nucleotides, this is basically a modified nucleotide that has 2 additional phosphate groups. Now, one thing though that is kind of important to understand is that phosphate groups have negative charges. And so here you have 3 phosphate groups, all with negative charges, bonded to each other. And so that's kind of like compressing a spring. Like if you put batteries into a remote, you have to press that spring down. So here you're forcing 3 negative charges together. So we basically talk about energy in ATP being stored between that second and that third phosphate group in the ATP molecule. Because of that potential energy, like as you're forcing those phosphates together, there's energy in that bond between the second and the third. So ATP is like a fully charged battery. There's lots of potential energy being stored there. Now, if we were to hydrolyze ATP, so hydrolyze means to add water to split or break apart a bond. When we hydrolyze ATP and that third phosphate group is broken off, it's been hydrolyzed, that is how energy is released. So here, energy is released when ATP is hydrolyzed into ADP and an inorganic phosphate. ADP, adenosine diphosphate, does have some potential energy between that first and second phosphate. So it's like a kind of a battery with a little bit less charge. But here, this molecule is adenosine diphosphate with just 2 phosphate groups. Now, there's less energy compared to ATP. So when we look at the big picture, we have ATP, a high energy molecule, and when energy is used by the cell, we hydrolyze that third phosphate group, releasing energy, which leaves us with a less stored energy in the molecule. And then we can attach a phosphate group back to ADP, phosphorylating ADP back into ATP. Now, this is what happens during aerobic respiration. Our cells create ATP from ADP and free-floating inorganic phosphates. So this right here is like the ATP-ADP cycle about how ATP can be released and then reformed. I do want to point out, though, adding that third phosphate onto ADP is not a random process. That is going to be done by enzymes through metabolic pathways. Okay, I think that is it for me. Great job, and good luck on cellular respiration and photosynthesis.